Story 1. The cold didn't just penetrate, it occupied. It took up residence in Elias Vance's bones, settling beneath the marrow-like silt in a forgotten riverbed. Even inside the crude, prefab aluminum shell of his cabin, dubbed Outpost Zero by a sarcastic, long-departed geological survey team, the air clung to a miserable 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Elias sat hunched over a folding table, the faint yellow glow of a kerosene lamp struggling against the encroaching shadow of the deep, snow-laden woods outside. He wasn't here for the cold, or the silence, though the silence was often the most oppressive presence of all. He was here for the sound, or rather, the lack of it, broken only by the things that shouldn't be. He lifted his headphones, the vinyl padding cold against his ears. The small, heavily modified recording console before him was the heart of his existence, a fortress of dials and blinking lights surrounded by a wasteland of notebooks and empty coffee mugs. He ran a gloved hand over his short, salt and pepper beer. 3.7 hours of static. Lovely, he muttered to the stale air. Elias was a retired bioacoustics researcher, or at least that was the professional title he used for his tax returns. In reality, he was an obsessive. 2 years ago, a logging crew had been pulled out of this sector of the vast, unnamed wilderness along the Maine-Quebec border after a series of incidents. Officially, bear attacks and hypothermia. Unofficially, the surviving foreman swore the forest was talking to them. Not just in echoes or the rustling of wind, but in precise, human voices, always whispering things they didn't want to hear. Old guilt, dead names, lost promises. Elias had dismissed it as panic-induced psychosis until he started sifting through the recovered audio logs. Hidden deep beneath the white noise of blizzard static, the crackle of two-way radios, and the groan of frozen spruce, he found it. A sound he had designated frequency alpha. It wasn't a scream or a growl. It was a perfect, seamless, almost impossible acoustic mimicry. In one 3-second snippet, it was the sound of a woman crying. In the next, the sharp, wet snap of a breaking bone. And in the most disturbing sequence, the one that had pulled Elias from his comfortable life and dragged him here, it was a flawless imitation of his late sister, Clara, calling his name. Not the name he went by now, but the childhood diminutive only she ever used. Eli. Where are you, Eli? He picked up the small, worn digital recorder, the one he always carried, and played the original file, adjusting the gain until the cabin was filled with the spectral, digital voice of his sister. It was a torture he inflicted upon himself daily, a necessary anchor to the terror. The voice was hollow, synthesized perfection, like a recording played back in a vacuum. It was Clara's voice, yet fundamentally wrong. It had no soul. He cut the playback abruptly, a shudder passing through him. The local legends, pieced together from half-forgotten tribal warnings and scattered pioneer diaries, called the entity many things: the echo thief, the voice hunter, the stitched scream. Elias preferred the name the French trappers had given it, a name that spoke to the creature's horrifying craft: the Chirurgeon. The surgeon, the one who cuts and shapes. The legend claimed the Chirurgeon was an entity of profound, insatiable loneliness and hunger, one that couldn't produce its own sounds. Instead, it stole the voices of its victims, weaving them into a horrifying, shifting tapestry that became its only means of communication. And possibly, its only visible form. A sudden, sharp thump against the aluminum wall behind him shattered the silence. Elias froze, his hand instinctively gripping the heavy, sheath-hunting knife strapped to his belt. The sound was too solid, too low to be a branch falling under snow load. It sounded like something large, heavy, and deliberate. He waited, breathing slow and shallow. The only subsequent sound was the faint hiss of the kerosene lamp. Bear, he told himself. Just a bear, woken up early. Go away, bear. Then came the second sound. It wasn't a thump. It was a rattle, like a child's toy dropped on a wooden floor. Elias knew the cabin floor was concrete. He knew the windows were frosted shut and locked. He knew he was miles from the nearest road, and dozens of miles from the nearest occupied dwelling. He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly, the sound suddenly deafening in the tiny cabin. He grabbed his rifle, a bolt-action .3006, and carefully slid the bolt home, chambering around. Show yourself, he called out, his voice hoarse and brittle. Silence. The sound of his own adrenaline thrumming in his ears. He moved to the small, circular porthole window facing the black woods. Peering through the small patch he'd scraped clear of frost, he saw nothing but the skeletal silhouettes of the spruce trees, their branches sagging under the weight of the last snowstorm. He was about to turn away when a new sound started. Not outside the window, but right there, in the main recording console, coming through the open, sensitive microphones he had running 24/7. It was the sound of a kettle whistling. Elias stared at the green, wavering audio spectrum on the small monitor screen. The frequency was perfect, the pitch rising to that ear-splitting shriek of steam pressure. It was the sound of domesticity, of safety, of a forgotten memory. It was the sound of Clara's old kitchen kettle, the one with the chipped ceramic handle. His hand trembled on the rifle stock. This was the Chirurgeon, testing him, playing its acoustic game. It wasn't just recording, it was synthesizing in real time. But why the whistle? Then the whistle cut off with a distinct plunk, the sound of the kettle being lifted from the stove. And a voice followed. Not harsh or spectral, but warm, mundane, and utterly terrifying. Elias, you're freezing out there. Come inside. I made tea. The voice was the most flawless imitation yet. It was Clara, not strained or spectral, but casual, tired, like a sister waiting up for her younger brother to come home late. Elias took a ragged, internal breath. He knew if he spoke, if he answered, the Chirurgeon would add his current voice, his current terror, his larceny. He could only listen. He watched the audio graph. The voice stopped, but the graph didn't flatline. A new sound began, almost too quiet to register, a soft, rhythmic thump thump thump. He recognized it instantly. It was the sound of a human heart beating, amplified and recorded with surgical clarity. The rate was slow, steady, resting. It was his heart, perhaps recorded months ago, now weaponized. He finally looked away from the console and toward the heavy steel door. The imitation of Clara spoke again, her voice now overlaid with the faint, steady drumming of a heartbeat. The door is open, Elias. It's too cold to be out there waiting. He knew the door was locked and barred from the inside. He knew there was nothing on the other side but a creature of hunger and stolen sound. He brought the rifle up, the sight aligning with the central locking mechanism of the door. He had expected the Chirurgeon to use the sounds of fear. He had prepared for screams, for howls, for the sound of shattering wood. He had not prepared for the sound of tea. The heartbeat thumped again, louder this time. The creature wasn't just mimicking sound, it was mimicking presence. It wanted him to believe his sister was waiting, just on the other side of the cold, thin door, inviting him into warmth and safety. Elias stood there, rifle ready, staring at the scarred steel door, knowing that the thing on the other side was constructing a new shape for itself, one stolen sound at a time. And he realized that Chirurgeon didn't need to break down the door. It just needed to wait until the human heart on the inside became too cold, too lonely, or too heartbroken to resist the sound of a loved one offering tea. He heard the final, fatal sound, not from the console, but from the gap beneath the door seal, a dry, rasping whisper, utterly devoid of Clara's voice, a pure, terrifying original sound. "I'm hungry, Eli." Elias took aim, the rifle heavy in his hands, knowing that answering that primal, terrifying truth with a bullet was the only way to silence the stolen memory. The silence of the night was about to be obliterated. Story 2. Acoustic retreat. Elias didn't hesitate. The creature had dropped its acoustic facade of a beloved sister and exposed the raw, fundamental horror of its intent: hunger. The moment the rasping, dry whisper, "I'm hungry, Eli," scraped through the gap beneath the door, all grief vanished, replaced by the instinct of survival. He didn't aim for center mass. He aimed for the lock. The .3006 round ripped through the small cabin air with an ear-splitting crack, instantaneously eclipsing the sounds of the whistling kettle and the rhythmic thump of the stolen heartbeat. The blast flash momentarily blinded him, painting the cramped space in searing orange and black. The heavy steel bolt mechanism, already weakened by the cold and years of neglect, exploded outward in a shower of shredded metal and sparks. Then, there was only a profound, ringing silence. Elias blinked rapidly, the residual flash fading. Smoke hung heavy and acrid in the kerosene lamp's feeble light. He waited, rifle still pressed to his shoulder, muscles locked. The door, the crude, industrial aluminum shell of Outpost Zero, was intact, yet violently ruptured. A fist-sized hole now marred the steel plate, jagged edges curled inward like petals of a morbid flower. But more telling than the damage was the air around the hole. It felt, impossibly, colder. A wave of frigid, dead air poured in, smelling of ozone and pine sap. Elias cautiously lowered the rifle, peering through the gap. The blast had torn a clear patch through the thick, swirling snow immediately outside. There was no body, no blood, no sign of flesh, fur, or bone. There was, however, a residue. Clinging to the splintered frame where the lock had been, and scattered lightly on the snow, was a fine, crystalline powder, shimmering faintly blue-white in the lamplight. It resembled crushed salt, but its geometry was too precise, too uniform. He nudged a pinch of it with the toe of his boot. It didn't melt. It evaporated instantly, leaving behind a sharp, metallic odor. Not organic. Or, at least, not conventionally organic. The Chirurgeon was not a bear. It was not a wolf or a misguided hunter. It was a predator crafted from sound and trauma, a being that seemed to construct its very existence from stolen acoustic material, and when struck, disintegrated into a crystalline proxy of bone and memory. Elias didn't wait for it to reconstitute. The cabin was compromised, its acoustic integrity shattered by the gunshot. He had given the creature a perfect recording of a high-caliber rifle firing indoors, a sound that could now be used to mimic the death shot itself, an oral weapon to induce panic. Time to go. He breathed, already moving. He had prepared for this. The first rule of hunting a phantom is to never allow it to corner you. His primary equipment was already packed. The modified recording console, his rifle, a week's worth of rations, and the digital recorder with its precious, horrifying recordings of Clara's voice. His evacuation plan had always pointed to the geologist's vault. 15 miles deeper into the Black Creek wilderness, nestled beneath the northern face of Mount Iblis, was a small, sealed bunker used decades ago for storing core samples, a subterranean, concrete cube. It was acoustically dead, thermally stable, and most importantly, defensible. Within 10 minutes, Elias had secured the Outpost Zero console into a heavily padded backpack, donned his thickest survival gear, and strapped on his snowshoes. He took one last, lingering look at the hole in the door, now whistling faintly with the wind. He knew what the Chirurgeon would do. It would follow. It might not need tracks, but the very act of Elias's retreat would be a narrative the creature could exploit. The ghost of the granite wall. Elias moved fast but methodically. The snow was a challenge, deep enough to require the snowshoes but firm enough to offer good purchase. The temperature was dropping, signaling a clear, dangerous night. Above him, the moon was already beginning its ascent, a cold disk of pearl in the ink-black sky. He kept the high-powered rifle slung across his back, favoring the shorter, more maneuverable shotgun loaded with rock-salt rounds, non-lethal, designed only to disrupt and confuse. Against an entity made of sound, a loud, dispersed, non-penetrating impact seemed more logical than a single rifle bullet. He had covered perhaps 3 miles, the only sound the rhythmic crunch of his snowshoes and his own labored breathing, when the forest started to change. Not visually. The woods remained a silent, frozen cathedral of spruce and hemlock. But acoustically, everything was shifting. His modified hearing aid, a sophisticated device he used to filter out low-frequency noise and isolate specific vocal patterns, began to register tiny, imperceptible alterations in the background environment. First, it was the sound of a dog barking, far too close. A high-pitched, insistent yelp, the sound of a small terrier demanding to be let out of a warm house. Elias froze. There were no domestic animals within 50 miles. A decoy. He pushed through the sound, focusing on the coordinates of the vault. The barking grew louder, closer, seeming to circle his position in the trees. It was a sound designed to elicit curiosity, maybe guilt, the sound of something vulnerable and dependent needing help. But then the sound abruptly warped. The sharp, high-pitched yelp was stretched and distorted, the audio equivalent of tearing rubber. It became less like a dog and more like a human throat trying desperately to imitate a dog. The sound stretched into a grotesque, inhuman whine, a sound of agony and failure. Elias shuddered and kept moving. He understood the game. The Chirurgeon used empathy as bait, and then horror as confirmation. The memory of the ascent as he marched, Elias's mind involuntarily drifted back, as it always did when the cold fear set in, to the granite wall. To Clara. Clara, his older sister, had been the best part of his life. A climber, a brilliant, reckless soul who saw the world only in vertical challenges. Elias, the scientist, the grounded one, had always worried. The accident had happened 2 years before the logging crew incidents. The ascent of Mount Caleb. A sudden, unforecasted micro-burst storm. He had been on the communications rig below. He heard everything. The initial distress signal was brief. A sudden, sharp cry of pain, followed by the terrifying, scraping sound of a carabiner failing against rock. Then, static. Elias had rushed up the mountain with the rescue team, but the blizzard hit faster than predicted. He reached the coordinates only to find an empty harness swinging wildly from a sheer pin, 20 feet of rope fraying in the wind, and a small, cracked voice recorder lying on a ledge. Clara's body was never recovered. The mountain kept her. But the voice recorder, that was the key. He had recovered that small digital file. 10 seconds of audio before the static overwhelmed it. It contained the sound of the carabiner snapping, the whistle of the wind, and then, immediately afterward, a sound he had never spoken of, not even to his closest colleagues. A sound that wasn't Clara's scream. It was a soft, guttural, utterly alien hiss. That hiss, he now realized, had been the Chirurgeon taking its prize. It had stolen the perfect, isolated sound of her final breath, her final pain, the perfect acoustic signature of his trauma. And now, 2 years later, it was using her voice, her keddah, her last sound, to hunt him. I am Eli, not Elias. I am a brother, not a scientist, he thought grimly, his face set against the wind. And I know what he took. The weeping wood he reached the creek, Black Creek, a narrow, frozen artery running between the high banks. He'd have to cross here to cut time to the vault. The creek crossing was a challenge. The ice was fractured and uneven, dusted with treacherous patches of powder snow. He removed his snowshoes and tested the ice with his boot. It held. He was halfway across, the air heavy and tight, when the final, most devastating sound began. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't a whistle. It was the sound of grief. It started as a low, humming sigh, coming not from one direction, but seeming to emanate from the trees themselves, surrounding him completely. The trees weren't just groaning under the wind, they were weeping. Then, the sound coalesced into a single, unmistakable voice, coming from the shadowed bank he had just left. I'm sorry, Eli, it was my fault. I shouldn't have gone up. It was Clara. The tone was devastating, broken, remorseful, self-condemning. The exact words he had spent 2 years telling himself. The perfect articulation of his paralyzing guilt. Elias stumbled on the ice, his heart hammering in a frantic, uneven rhythm. This was different. This wasn't a lure. It was a psychological attack, a direct strike at the central pillar of his emotional defense. It knows what I think. It knows what I regret. He could hear the creature now, a faint, dry scraping noise overlaid with the sound of his sister's sorrow. The sound was moving across the bank, approaching the ice. No, Elias whispered, shaking his head against the assault. You don't get to use that. He brought the shotgun up, aimed not at the sound, but at the ice directly in front of him. He fired a rock-salt round. The blast was immediate and chaotic. It wasn't just noise. The salt pellets peppered the ice, scattering the crystalline residue that had begun to form on the frozen surface. The sound of Clara's voice abruptly fractured, dissolving into a hideous, high-speed babble, like a tape recorder spooling out of control. He ran, scrambling across the last few feet of fractured ice, dragging himself onto the opposite bank. The silence that followed was absolute. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Elias leaned against a tree, catching his breath, knowing he had bought himself perhaps 60 seconds. He risked a look back. The bank was empty. The ice was still. But as he looked up, following the line of the trees, he saw it. At the very top of the tallest spruce, silhouetted against the pale moonlight, was a shape. It was too tall, too spindly to be a human, too angular and jointed to be an animal. It seemed to be constructed of long, segmented limbs, thin as branches but capable of gripping the trunk with impossible stability. And it moved with an alarming, silent speed, not by climbing, but by vaulting from the top of one tree to the next, a grotesque, broken jointed shadow traversing the canopy. The Chirurgeon wasn't attacking him directly on the ground. It was maintaining an acoustic advantage, moving through the air, overhead, keeping pace with him but never committing to the physical form that a bullet could destroy. It was waiting for him to reach his refuge. The geologist's vault was now less than half a mile away. Elias ran. The trees overhead vaulted and twisted, making no sound of snapping twigs or rustling needles, only the faint, whooshing displacement of air as the entity moved. He crashed through the final stretch of undergrowth and saw it. A small, concrete facade facade built into the side of the granite cliff face, the geologist's vault. The door was heavy, steel-plated, secured with a thick, rotating wheel lock. It was the best shelter he had. He threw himself at the door, spinning the lock wheel with gloved hands, his movements frantic. Click, click, click. The steel bolts withdrew with a grinding protest. He wrenched the heavy door open, stumbled inside, and slammed it shut, spinning the wheel lock until his arms ached, securing the bolts. He leaned against the cold, interior concrete, breathing hard, the smell of dust and old samples filling his lungs. He was safe. The silence inside the vault was total, muffling the sounds of the outside world. I made it. It can't get me here. He slid down the wall, exhausted, the rifle resting across his knees. He reached for his canteen, his entire body trembling from the combination of cold and terror. And then, he heard it. It wasn't external. It was already inside the vault. Not a sound of attack, but a sound of patient, horrifying domesticity, echoing gently off the concrete walls, waiting for him. The distinct, sharp shriek of a copper kettle at full boil. The Chirurgeon had not followed him from the trees. It had somehow gone ahead. It had waited inside his supposed sanctuary, ready to offer him a cup of tea. The scream of the kettle rose to an impossible pitch, vibrating in his skull, perfectly mimicking the sound, but utterly devoid of heat or comfort. It was the sound of a memory waiting to scald him alive. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.